For more than a century, the movies have brought our most vivid nightmares to life. Often, the fear is conjured from fantasy, from imagining the unimaginable. But it's even more frightening when the demons are real.
Based on a true story. Just that small phrase that these events actually happened sort of makes the film much more both relevant and much more terrifying.
Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Each of these characters had its origins in the same true story, the unspeakable crimes of a single man. His name was Ed Gein.
The writers of fiction, who are really good at it, could take Ed Gein and you could make him almost anything you wanted to make him in the world of horror, because he had so much to work with.
Gein's crimes were committed against the living and the dead. The depraved acts of a damaged mind, they slashed through the surface of a complacent age, revealing the darkness that lurked just below. His twisted world became America's obsession. And what is at bottom, the story of a boy and his mother, became the template for half a century of horror.
There's something about Gein that appeals to the morbid curiosity within all of us. It's so macabre, so bizarre, so deviant that we can't look away.
How long have you known Mr. 7 years? 7 years. What kind of a man did you know him as? Well, a man, he's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little hot.
No one ever claimed that Plainfield, Wisconsin was a small-town paradise. In the fall of 1957, it was home to about 700 people, a quiet, hard-working place on the windswept flatlands of central Wisconsin.
They had the main hardware store for that area, a food market. They had a restaurant or two, a saloon. There was nothing that would distinguish it from, probably 100 other communities in Wisconsin.
That all changed over the course of one cold weekend, with a mysterious disappearance and a shocking discovery. Saturday, November 16th, marked the beginning of an annual Wisconsin ritual. Deer season. In Plainfield, the men hunted not for sport, but for food. Their trophies would be killed, hung in barns, and dressed out, gutted and butchered.
All the males would be out in the woods. And so the main street would be a quiet place.
Particularly quiet that morning was Bernice Warden's hardware store. Though the store was supposed to be open, the 58-year-old proprietor was nowhere to be found.
I lived across the street from the hardware store where Bernice Warden ran her business. I believe it was in the afternoon. People were starting to wonder why the store was locked and where was Bernice Warden.
So her son came back from deer hunting himself and found that the place was a mess. There was blood all over the floor, and they started to investigate what might have possibly happened to her.
Interviewed by police, Bernice Warden's son mentioned a frequent customer who'd been in just the day before to check on the price of antifreeze. Ed Gein, a 51-year-old bachelor who lived in an isolated farmhouse outside of town.
Everybody had a role to play in this town. And I think that Ed Gein was recognized probably not as the village idiot, but as a village oddball, I would say.
That evening, about 2 hours after Bernice Warden was reported missing, Sheriff Art Schley headed out with another deputy to Ed Gein's farm.
If you ever wanted to have a Halloween party, that would be a great place for it. It was a spooky house out in the edge of town, and it was dark, and there wasn't a sign of life there.
The doors of the house were locked, so the officers decided to take a look inside the woodshed.
They went in investigating with flashlights. It was pitch black because there was no electricity and no lights. And one of the lawmen felt something bump against his shoulder. He turned, shined his flashlight on it, and indeed, there was Bernice Warden hanging from the rafters, upside down with her head off and gutted like a deer.
Ed Gein was taken into custody that night. As he sat quietly in his cell at the Waushara County Jail, police continued to search his woodshed and then cautiously ventured into his home. Inside, they would discover a horrific scene. Bernice Warden's gutted carcass, it turned out, was only Ed Gein's latest grim creation. On November 16, 1957, the quiet farming town of Plainfield, Wisconsin was abuzz with rumors about the murder of one of its residents. Bernice Warden's mutilated and decapitated corpse had been found that night in the woodshed of 51-year-old Ed Gein. With Gein now in custody, police prepared to enter his house for the first time. It was a cold, dark night, and the place had no electricity. The officers had only lanterns and flashlights to illuminate the scene.
Well, Gein's entire house was in a state of really unimaginable squalor. It was so completely overwhelmed with the trash of a decade.
It was chaos in terms of housekeeping. Well, you don't keep house. The kitchen was a jumble. Everything, you know, there was dirty things here and newspapers laid up here and junk all over the place.
But the officers discovered much more than mere filth. In plain sight, scattered throughout the house, was a ghastly array of human remains.
Investigators were completely stunned and appalled to discover this incredible collection of human body objects. And among the things they found were bowls that had been made from the tops of human skulls.
And then they found what looked like trinkets, but it was like a string of nipples from breasts, all on a string.
They found a shade pole that was made from a set of women's lips.
And they had found other body parts there. Then you'd go out into what would be like a living room, and they found furniture, a lampshade that was made out of human skin, chairs that were upholstered in human skin.
They found face masks. Gein had apparently flayed the skin from the heads of the victims and preserved them and stuffed them with paper and hung them on the wall as decorations.
Each disturbing discovery seemed to top the previous one, until finally, one officer came upon a brown paper bag.
He opened the paper bag and saw a hank of human hair, and as he himself later described it, he said he had no idea what possessed him to do it, but just sort of reflexively, he reached in and pulled this thing out.
To his horror, he discovered it was a woman's face. Worse yet, it was someone the cops recognized, a local bar owner named Mary Hogan, who had gone missing 3 years before. For 30 hours, the man apparently responsible for this gruesome spectacle sat in his jail cell, refusing to speak to investigators. Finally, they confronted him with Bernice Worden's corpse. And with that, Ed Gein began to come clean.
He was perfectly happy to cooperate with the police. You know, all he asked for was a slice of apple pie with some cheddar cheese on top of it.
And according to the investigator, Ed ate the thing, and after that he told them anything they wanted to know.
They said, well, what's all these body parts in here, Ed? You know, how many people did you kill? All the dead stuff in his house, they just assumed that it was like murder victims.
All told, Gein would confess to only 2 killings: Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. The rest of his grisly artifacts, he said, were crafted from corpses he had stolen from local cemeteries.
Plainfield woke up that Sunday morning to find out what had been living in their community for all these years, and that was Ed Gein.
My dad, he couldn't tell us what had happened. He just said, I want you to come in and watch the news tonight with me. And the news came up on the television. He was the person. I just said to my dad, oh my gosh, that's Ed.
We were all upset. We were all devastated. We were horrified about what had happened. It was a terrible, horrible thing.
It was just such a complete shock, I guess. It was something that was a little bit difficult to talk about.
It wasn't just the murder of Bernice Worden that was so disturbing. It was the other terrible things that he did that was upsetting so many people.
I mean, this is a guy who had been living in their community almost all his life and been a babysitter for their children, had been eating at their table. Well, look what he did and how he did. They couldn't believe it.
Well, I figured he was just perfectly harmless and rather simple.
Plainfield's shock would soon be America's. Almost immediately, hordes of reporters descended on the town. It was the beginning of Ed Gein's transformation from anonymous psychotic to cultural icon. And it could all be traced back to the story of his childhood. Because in the words of Norman Bates, a boy's best friend is his mother. In November 1957, the gruesome tale of Ed Gein was making headlines across America. The country's morbid fascination with the man the papers were calling the Mad Butcher of Plainfield was not lost on author Robert Bloch, who was living in Wisconsin at the time.
It was exactly the time that the Gein case was breaking in the newspapers, and Bloch immediately recognized that it would be a wonderful basis for a horror story.
The result was Bloch's 1959 novel, Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock would bring to the big screen the following year.
The story of Psycho is the story of Norman Bates, a single, deeply disturbed mama's boy, for lack of a better word, who runs a hotel and murders unsuspecting young women who cause him to have any sexual urges or impulses.
One of the main things that Bloch took from the Gein case was the psychological relationship between Norman and his mother, which very much parallels that between Annie and his mother.
Augusta Gein had been dead 12 years when police entered the house she had once shared with her son. As they worked their way from room to room, searching for clues that might explain what would drive someone to commit such crimes,